Sherman's Atlanta campaign was one of the most famous and decisive campaigns of the entire Civil War, but the success was only made possible after he and Ulysses S. Grant had overseen the lifting of the Confederate siege of Chattanooga after the Battle of Chickamauga. As a result, Sherman would start his Atlanta campaign using Chattanooga as his main supply and communications base, and he would launch that campaign with more than twice as many men at his disposal than the Army of Tennessee, which would start the campaign commanded by Joseph Johnston. Johnston, the man Longstreet had suggested to replace Bragg, would eventually be named commander after Bragg offered his resignation of the command near the end of 1863, and his friend Jefferson Davis accepted it, to Bragg's surprise. During the Civil War, one of the tales that was often told among Confederate soldiers was that Joseph E. Johnston was a crack shot who was a better bird hunter than just about everyone else in the South. However, as the story went, Johnston would never take the shot when asked to, complaining that something was wrong with the situation that prevented him from being able to shoot the bird when it was time. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it was aptly used to demonstrate the Confederates' frustration with a man who everyone regarded as a capable general. Johnston began the Civil War as one of the South's senior commanders, leading the ironically named Army of the Potomac to victory in the Battle of First Bull Run over Irvin McDowell's Union Army. But Johnston would become known more for losing by not winning. Johnston was never badly beaten in battle, but he had a habit of strategically withdrawing until he had nowhere left to retreat. When Johnston had retreated in the face of McClellan's army before Richmond in 1862, he finally launched a complex attack that not only failed, but left him severely wounded, forcing him to turn over command of the Army of Northern Virginia to Robert E. Lee. Johnston and Confederate President Jefferson Davis had a volatile relationship throughout the war, but Johnston was too valuable to leave out of service, so he found himself in command of the Army of Tennessee at the beginning of 1864. Failing to secure the capture of any major northern cities, or the recognition of Great Britain or France, or the complete destruction of any northern armies, the Confederacy's last chance to survive the Civil War was the election of 1864. Democrats had been pushing an anti-war stance, or at least a stance calling for a negotiated peace, for years. So the South hoped that if a Democrat defeated President Lincoln, or if anti-war Democrats could retake the Congress, the North might negotiate peace with the South. In the election of 1862, anti-war Democrats made some gains in Congress and won the governorship of the state of New York, so Confederates were hopeful that trend would continue in the election of 1864. Before beginning the overland campaign against Lee's army, Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln devised a new strategy that would eventually implement total war tactics. Grant aimed to use the Army of the Potomac to attack Lee and/or take Richmond. Meanwhile, General Sherman, now in command of the Department of the West, would attempt to take Atlanta and strike through Georgia. In essence, having already cut the Confederacy in half with the Vicksburg campaign, he now intended to bisect the eastern half. On top of all that, Grant and Sherman were now intent on fully depriving the Confederacy of the ability to keep fighting. Sherman put this policy in effect during his march to the sea by confiscating civilian resources and literally taking the fight to the Southern people. For Grant, it meant a war of attrition that would steadily bleed Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. To take full advantage of the North's manpower, the Union ended prisoner exchanges in 1864 in an attempt to ensure the Confederate armies would not be bolstered by paroled prisoners. Major General Sherman's Division of the Mississippi had within its organization 3 armies, all taking their names from rivers west: the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Ohio. Each command and corps consisted of veterans who fought in Union victories at Shiloh, Corinth, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, so they were confident at the start of the summer that they would ultimately reach Atlanta. Their commander was also confident, as Sherman later recalled in his memoirs.